Very good morning and welcome to the Results Operations Center. And this, of course, is where the focus is going to be on for at least the next 5 days, if not more, in South Africa. Welcome to it. And of course, Morning Live, we're giving you a glimpse of what's to come. And of course, those boards behind us, that's where our eyes will be glued to starting on Sunday evening. At the moment, it's just the IEC's logo on it. But of course, that's where we're going to be watching the results trickle in real time. Thanks so much for joining us. 2 days, 23 hours and 21 minutes to be exact until South Africa, or at least the majority of South Africans, go to the polls, because special votes will start tomorrow and of course Sunday from 8 until 5 p.m. But of course, I am not alone. SABC Head of News, Phathiswa Magopeni, thanks so much for speaking to us this morning. And the excitement is building now.
Good morning, Sakina, and good morning, SABC News viewers. I don't know whether to call it excitement or anxiety. It's a combination. There's a lot that's happening behind the scenes, and we hope that we're going to pull it. And this is what we are here for.
Yeah. And this, of course, is our set. We have some touch screens that we'll be using throughout to keep you abreast of developments. But of course, it's been a hard slog to get here, Phathiswa. Starting with the coverage and trying to cover as many, because it's practically impossible to cover every single manifesto, every single rally, but as much as possible. So let's talk about that process, because we do get a lot of flack as the public broadcaster if we miss out on something.
Yes, we actually had to work out a formula as editors to decide how we approach our elections coverage, starting with the special programming that we launched with the with the service delivery gauge and elections 360, which is a version that we launched later. But as far as coverage of parties, independent candidates is concerned, we actually tried to cover everything that was active on the ground. So that was our approach, because you also had parties that were not active at all. So those we would then invite to interviews on different platforms. But with the parties, considering that we had 325 political parties that were contesting, it was always going to be a nightmare to do that. But we tried to catch literally everyone who was on the ground campaigning. I mean, there was a day when we had 15 parties out campaigning, and in addition to that, we had 5 manifestos being launched on the same day. I think it was a Saturday. But we actually pulled it, and these are things that we pay attention to make sure that we don't violate what is what is prescribed as equitable coverage for political parties. But with independent candidates, knowing that we have more than 1,500 independent candidates that are contesting, we also had to look at how to make the platforms more inclusive in the way we covered them, bearing in mind that some of these candidates are contesting wards. So what we had to do was to look at our radio platforms and include those on the radio platforms, because they are more localized and language specific in the way we covered them.
And I think very often that's where we also get criticized, but people forget that the radio platforms are equally important and have equal great reach in this country, reaching into every nook and cranny, and as you say, even more nuanced in terms of the languages in terms of which you can actually reach people.
Actually, it's your long and heavy consumption when you talk about radio platforms. And yes, with the fact that they are specific in terms of the languages, and the fact that they are able to go to street level issues, because that is what local government elections are about. So we were able to give those platforms the opportunity to deal with the candidates at the level where they are going to be heard and they are going to be able to explain their intentions.
And then, of course, the parties always crying foul, especially at this time. You just can't seem to win. But I've also heard great compliments from some of the parties about the coverage, saying that they acknowledge that, yes, the SABC really did go above and beyond, tried to actually give a voice as far as possible. But as the head of news, what have you received? What have you had to respond to?
It's been brutal. It's been brutal. Yes, we getting positive feedback in terms of the quality of our coverage and what we've been able to cover on the ground. Because one thing that you can't do is to ignore observable reality. Because the public is going to call you out when you are going to talk about things or ignore things that are there and that everybody is able to talk about, and you decide to conceal that. So we had to reflect the reality on the ground as is. And in fact, much of our coverage has been directed by the public, because the public would say, we've been watching this, can you please come to our area? This is what we're experiencing in our area. So it's been a process of co-creation in terms of how we've been producing our content. But as far as the political parties are concerned, so what I'm talking about is brutal. The problem that I've experienced is that when you say to people, go to ICASA for your complaints, ICASA is going to adjudicate, and we are going to go there and explain ourselves. Because one time we had a party that came and said, but you are reporting something that doesn't exist. And I said, but this is observable reality. It happened. So how do I pretend as if it wasn't there? And I'm not going to change the story. We stand by our story, go to ICASA, and we'll go and explain ourselves. And we'll see who's right and who's wrong. But the people refuse to go there. And then they call you arrogant, and you then advise to go and form your own political party because you are behaving like opposition. But these are things that you take on the chin because it's part of the terrain. So you deal with them at that level.
And we need to call it by its name for what it is, because what it is intimidation.
It is.
Where people would call you and they would say to you, but why are you decampaigning us? Where people, they call you and they say, but why did you have to show that? But as you say, it is not for us to censor. It is for us to show what is actually happening.
Yeah. And here's the reality. We look at media freedom in isolation as journalists, and yet media freedom is interlinked with the right of the public to know. So our existence, if it doesn't address the access to information and the public's right to know, it's as good as non-existent. And here's the other problem is, we know censorship. Censorship is despicable, and censorship is repulsive, because what it does, it erodes the same right of the public to know, and we can't pretend as if it's okay, and there's no way to explain away censorship. It is what it is.
It has been very interesting, I must say, being on the ground as well, where you go, you host a debate or you have a discussion amongst parties represented in council, and inevitably, for example, Party X would say, but we need to sweep, and you have to then explain, no, this is not a council meeting, this is not parliament, this is not your council, this is but a broadcast, and therefore those rules that apply to you in those settings don't apply here.
That is absolutely true. And something that we've been trying to explain, it is in the editorial policy of the SABC, that 5.20.7, that it is the exclusive right of designated editorial staff to make editorial decisions. Those decisions can't come from externally, from anyone who's outside the news system. And I've said this, not even within the SABC. So you also have those types, the sophisticated types that would say, oh, I just want to assist you, or this is between us. It's not applicable. It cannot be done. It cannot be done.
And then, of course, just looking back with hindsight now, because the elections are upon us, tomorrow's special votes start. In terms of some of the blind spots that we may have had in our coverage, as we look back and try to assess our own coverage, what we've done well, what perhaps we didn't do as well, what we could improve upon, how would you assess our coverage as SABC News to this point?
I think one of the things that hindered some of the things that we would have done, it's the COVID-19 restrictions, and we had to observe those. We would have wanted to do more OBs, because that's where we engage with the public, and we would have wanted to have our radio stations out there engaging with the public, but we couldn't do much of that. We did it, but to a certain extent, and we still had to do it under restrictions. But the biggest problem that I think with time, with enough time, we would have been able to address, is voter education. There was a session that we had that included UNDP and the IEC talking about what to expect, what needs to be done, what are the processes that need to be followed, why it's important for the public to go and vote. So we had that session, but I wish we had more of that. But time limitations and the COVID-19 restrictions meant that we couldn't do much of what we wanted to do.
And so right to pick up on that, because I looked at some of the comments during that particular broadcast that was earlier this week on Morning Live with Leanne as well. And people were saying exactly that. Because I think somehow we take for granted that because this is not the first time, the second time that we are voting, that people would know. But forgetting that there's always new entrants into the market, first-time voters who still need the education. So it really doesn't get old.
It doesn't, to the extent that I think one of the episodes of the daily service delivery gauge, they had to deal with the difference between national elections and local government elections, because people still tend to confuse those as to who exactly do you vote for and what are you voting for, because it's actually different. And then again, the processes that have to be followed, and first-time voters, as you say, it's something that we didn't pay much attention to, and I do hope that actually, it shouldn't even be something that gets done only during elections. It should be an ongoing education program that voters tend to get exposed to.
So voter education for one, but also the SABC traditionally has always been criticized for behaving like a state broadcaster as opposed to a public broadcaster. Let's talk to that. And again, what have we managed to improve upon this time around? Where are the weaknesses still?
For the news division, it boils down to what the editorial policy prescribes. Because what the ICASA regulations prescribe is in addition to what the policy says. They apply concurrently during elections. So we had to adhere what the editorial policies say, that our decisions are the final determiner in terms of what gets covered. No one else is going to determine that. And in some of the cases, you would have people trying to impose interviews. And what that does is to distort our coverage, because we can't account for the balance that's required and the equitable coverage that's required. So we had to make sure that no instructions come from outside the system. It's all contained and it's in line with the policies.
You know, I'm looking at my phone as messages are coming through on Twitter already. Incidentally, you know, some of the difficulties, and perhaps some of the viewers don't know this, at a time like this, what you wear is a thing. So you want to come on wearing a red dress and you're like, ooh, EFF. I can't come on wearing a yellow dress. Oh, it's going to be cope. And given the number of political parties that we have, it's the full spectrum of colors. So it becomes so difficult. Incidentally, political analyst Aubrey Machikwe sends me a message and he says, yellow and green. And you see, these sort of things we laugh about, but some people take this seriously.
It is, I mean, a color is a language. Whatever you put on communicates. So it's always going to be a very thin line to try and address. Oftentimes, even journalists, when they're out in the field, and you'd be covering a political party manifesto launch or a campaign without even being conscious of how you are going to be perceived just because of the colors that you are wearing. It is correct that they communicate. It is correct.
So we just take a look at some of the issues being addressed, saying we thought you will call professors to analyze the current COVID-19 spreaders at the ANC rallies and these sort of things. And these were things that we also had to take cognizance of.
Yes, we had to do that. And in fact, they have, across our programming, so some of the programming would pick up on that there was this event and there was no observation of COVID-19 regulations. We report on them, and that's all we can do. We only report on them, but there are law enforcement agencies in this country that are supposed to do their job. It is not our job to perform to that level. Ours is to call out what we see and report on it as we see it, which is what we did.
And inevitably, and I think just to prove the point that we tried to touch on earlier. This one is from Shirl Heath, who says, why have SABC not mentioned UIM, United Independent Movement, Neil de Beer at all, the new kids on the block?
This is what, back to the point that I was talking about. You've got to be on the ground if we are to cover your manifesto or we are to cover your campaign. So if parties are not active, and in fact there's been a number of them that were not active, if parties are not active and they are not raising their hand to say, here we are, here's the work that we are doing, we are on the ground on this day. We literally attended to all the parties that submitted their manifestos because, their programs, because we even said, including the big parties, send us your diaries and schedules in advance because there's a lot that we need to deal with. On any day, you would have new parties, independents that we are covering, and on some days we had to exclude completely what is known as big parties, and they were upset, but they were correctly upset, and we're very happy with them being upset because we still had to accommodate the small parties, the new parties, and the independent candidates.
Yeah. Michael Atkins, the issues that you raise of duplicate candidates is something that we will raise with the IEC in trying to understand exactly how all of this works. Yeah. But this is it. This is going to be the nerve center, the hub. This is where the pulse of the nation is going to be monitored for the next week, and we will be here for you as SABC News. Sis Phathiswa, you want to say something?
Just on the programming, we are going full steam 24 hours from the day of the vote until the voting, until the counting is done. So we're going to be 24 hours live on the news channel. There is a team dedicated to results reporting from 1 a.m. To 5 a.m. So we are going full 24 hours, and we have 13 radio stations here, broadcasting in 13 languages, and that includes, in addition to official languages, Xhosa and Kwedam, and this is XKFM that serves a Northern Cape community of indigenous people. So that's the level of deployment that we have here. But here's one thing that is the greatest danger to what we call a public mandate, and I can't not talk about this. We have spent or allocated 29 million rand for the coverage of elections. And this is money that would have gone to news infrastructure because there are things that we would want to do that we can't do because this money has to go to the coverage of elections. And this is money, if you know the split of the revenue collection of the SABC, 86% of that is a combined sponsorship and advertising revenue. 11% of that is license fee collection, which fluctuates depending on compliance. And then you have the 3% that comes from government. It's a government grant that goes to Channel Africa and education programming. It doesn't even cover the rest of the education programming of this ABC. And in fact, that amount wouldn't even cover half the salary bill of the news division. So you literally have a public broadcaster that is in principle, but in practice, it is a commercial broadcaster. And the minute you leave a public mandate responsibility to market forces, you are in the greatest danger because our programming becomes about revenue generation rather than serving the citizens. And I think it's something that needs attention. We're sitting here having allocated 29 million rand that comes from fabric softener advertising. We are running a constitutional project for the country.
And that is a very important issue that we need to, I think, expand upon. We will have time, especially on voting day. But this is it, South Africa. As South Africa decides 2021, the SABC will be giving you wall-to-wall coverage.